I will trust in you. I will trust in you. My God. There is a fountain. Who is the King? Victorious warrior. And the Lord of everything. My rock, my shelter. My very own. Blessed Redeemer, who reigns upon the throne. There is a fountain. Who is the King of Kings? Who is the King? He's my victorious warrior. And He's my Lord. He's my Lord of everything. He's my rock, my shelter. He's the one we can lean on. Nobody like Him. Hallelujah. He reigns. He reigns. Yes, He does. He's a glorious Savior. He's a wonderful God. And He's the Lord of everything. My very own. Blessed Redeemer. And He reigns. Who reigns upon the throne. Who reigns Well, good morning, Mount Carmel Baptist Church, and for those who are watching along with us, whether live or later on today, this is part 2 of Defending the Resurrection. If you want the first part, you can just go to our Facebook page, MT Carmel Demorest, or go to our YouTube channel, MT Carmel Demorest, and you can check out part 1 and revisit those the evidence, the first part of the evidence that I gave to you yesterday. I do want to mention before I dive into part 2. Don't forget this coming Sunday, Easter Sunday at 11 o'clock, we're going to have service, Easter worship service on the back lawn outside. And we would love for you to come out, whether you're a part of Mount Carmel or you've been watching online or you just want to be at a church with the church on Easter Sunday. We would love for you to come and join us as we make much of Jesus. We are asking, it's not necessarily that you're reserving like a, I don't want to say like a place as much as you're, if you can let us know how many's in your party so that we can make sure there's enough chairs out there for everybody. If you can do that, text RSVP to our Text in Church number. That's 706-525-5351. Or you go to our website, mtcarmeldemerest.com, and you can click on the Reserve tab, and the form will pop up there. But we would love to have you, and we're really looking forward to it. If you can bring your own lawn chair if you want to. We will have communion at the beginning of the service, Lord willing, of course, and weather permitting, it will be all outside, and if it does rain, we'll move into the sanctuary. So let's go ahead and dive head first into part 2 of Defending the Resurrection. If you have your coffee, it's early this morning. I gotta wake up. Here's what we're looking at. I'm not going to rehearse the material that I gave to you yesterday. I'm begging you to look that up yourself. Okay, so go back to part 1 and review that. But the part that I just need to make sure you have in mind today as we go through this part 2 were the 3 minimal facts. If you need the definition for the 3 minimal facts, like what minimal facts means, go back to part 2. All right, part 1. But for the sake of what we're doing today, the 3 things that you need to know that's historical Christian bedrock. No one, the consensus is virtually all scholars, whether they're Christian, believers, agnostic, just have sincere doubts, or atheistic, militant atheistic, virtually all scholars concede these 3 facts. This is like the critical mass of Christianity. 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. He actually existed. And this one is so well attested to, again, outside the Scripture. Go look at the sources from yesterday. The next 2, and it's important that we notice the distinction in what I'm saying, is we're not saying that it's necessarily a historical fact that Jesus rose from the dead. That's not what they're saying. It's that a group of Jesus' disciples sincerely believed he rose from the dead. So what we're wanting to look for is what can account for their sincere belief, this group's sincere belief. And then the 3rd minimal fact, which is another one that's highly attested. I mean, anybody in their right mind doesn't deny this. Is the who we know as the Apostle Paul was once a persecutor of this Jesus movement, the church, and then he came to a point and a place where he sincerely believed that Jesus rose from the dead, and consequently, became the greatest Christian missionary on the planet. So those are the 3 facts. Now, what we're doing in this historical analysis, we're arguing for the historicity of the resurrection, is we're going to look at some naturalistic explanations today, and I'll give this to you on the slide so you can kind of see it. We're going to ask the question without invoking God, without saying God raised Jesus from the dead to account for these 3 facts. Let's rehearse some of the naturalistic explanations, naturalistic narratives, stories that try or attempt to account for these 3 facts without invoking God. And I don't think there's any problem with this whatsoever. And so, in case you're wondering what naturalism is with regard to philosophy, an approach, a worldview about history, is what we're saying is naturalists maintain that nature or the physical universe, essentially everything you can sense, is all that exists, and there's nothing outside of nature or supernatural, meaning there's no spiritual realm or God. Therefore, they preclude, not necessarily conclude, okay, that God could not raise Jesus. So what we're looking for in a naturalistic explanation is saying this, again, without invoking something supernatural above and beyond the natural realm, can a naturalistic explanation cover the scope of these 3 facts? So that's what we're looking at today. The first story, all right, the first attempt to, again, cover these three facts is one called the conspiracy theory. And there's not necessarily really technical terminology in the sense what the theories are named. You'll find them named differently throughout certain works. But the idea is essentially that in some way, the disciples are responsible for stealing the body of Jesus. That it's contrived. It's a conspiracy. They took the body and then launched this, Jesus movement, the church. Now, a couple of things. So you got to account for the three facts. Now, let's just go through them real quick. So this is the test you can use with anything. If you're on social media, you're watching the History Channel, which very rarely actually does real history, but any of these things, just run any theory through the three facts. Does it account for all three facts? So the first one, does the conspiracy theory allow for the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion? Yeah, no problem. That's maintained in this theory. The second one is, does a group of Jesus' disciples sincerely believe that God raised Jesus from the dead and Jesus appeared? It's not sincere belief, all right? They can account for the empty tomb, right, because they took the body. But here's a couple of things then you got to take account for. So, number one, they would not have used the testimony of women. This is another fascinating part about history. Josephus even makes a mention that the testimony of women during 1st century AD, and probably even before and after, was just not considered as credible as a man's testimony. All right, this is a patriarchal society. And what's really interesting, okay, no matter even when you date the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but think about this. If the disciples stole the body, the Gospels maintain that the first people to attest to the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth were a group of his women followers. And here's the thing. If Jesus really wasn't raised from the dead and the disciples stole the body, you would not, and you're making up the resurrection. Like you're writing about it. You're not attesting to anything. You're imagining it and putting it on paper. You don't put the women at the tomb, Sunday morning. If anything, if you're Peter, you put yourself there. You put a member of the Sanhedrin, maybe Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, Pontius Pilate, right? Men with some type of standing, and yet all the Gospels maintain that the women were the first ones to witness to the empty tomb. The second thing is they would have described the resurrection. This is one of the most fascinating things. I never forget the first time I heard it. It's really interesting that all the Gospels never give a description of the resurrection event itself. That you don't have a description of what it was like when, the commentators, when this divine energy, so to speak, came down or whatever happened and stood Jesus back up again. All the gospel writers know is it was Sabbath, and then the next day after the Sabbath, a group of women followers went to show their devotion in anointing the body of Jesus. And it's like, so what does resurrection look like? And all the disciples are like, we don't know because none of us were there, which is just fascinating, because if the body's stolen and you're writing the resurrection narrative, I've shared this with the church. The church has imagined what happened to Jesus's body in resurrection. Our songs are much more laden with supernatural activity when we describe the resurrection than the Bible ever describes. It's just completely silent. They witness an empty tomb, which is really interesting. Number 3, people won't die for a known lie. I showed this the two towers because people fail to make a distinction between something like 9/11 and then what the disciples would have done. And I'm not talking about necessarily Christianity or Islam. That's not the point. I'm talking about the difference between insincere and sincere belief. No matter what you think about 9/11, okay, my point being this: the people who participated in that terrorist act sincerely believed that they were bastions of the truth. Okay, they did not know that what they believed was a law, but they sincerely believed it, and acted upon it. Here's the issue with the disciples: if the disciples take the body, there's not sincere belief there. And one of the things that we're bad to do is we're bad to read history back into a movement. So yes, Christianity, for by and large, dominates the world, especially the Roman Empire. From 300 A.D., culturally all the way up to now. And people have become politically powerful, financially prosperous because of Jesus and his doctrine. But what you got to catch is the disciples, they don't experience any of that. The original group of Jesus's followers, they were persecuted, thought to be crazy. The church took care of them, but they didn't get rich. And so the point is this: and church tradition eventually describes them as all being martyred except for John, and he was even exiled on Patmos. So the point being is, if they did this in hopes of fame and wealth, then the plan backfired bad. Peter, who's shown here according to early church tradition, was crucified upside down. All right. So again, this is if at some point one of these guys has to break down and be like, we made it up, we stole his body, this is a lie, and yet, and the difference, and they knew it, and then last but not least is the third part of the minimal facts. Okay, so they steal Jesus's body. Remember, the Apostle Paul is not a part of the original 12. He comes to faith later. And he says over and over again, and personal testimony, Jesus, the risen Jesus, appeared to me, and that's what converted him. So, catch this: you have the crucifixion of Jesus. Maybe we'll say 50% of minimal fact 2 that it describes that the disciples sincerely believed, quasi-believed that God raised Jesus from the dead. But an empty tomb, just an empty tomb, doesn't convert the Apostle Paul. So the conspiracy theory is just and I'll say this is not one that's maintained by most scholars. It may be popular, you may find it on social media or, like I said, a TV show, but by and large this theory is just outright dismissed now because it can't account for all three facts. Now, this next theory is the apparent death theory, or it's sometimes called the swoon theory. SWOON. I'm going to take a sip of this. Now, and the idea of this theory is simply this: Jesus did not die completely. I guess it kind of reminds me of the Princess Bride thing. He's almost dead, but it appeared that he died. But he didn't, in fact, die. And then when he was laid in the cool tomb, he revived and then, of course, showed himself alive. Now, a couple of things. Let's go ahead and answer these questions. Go back through the three facts. Does the apparent death theory account for the crucifixion of Jesus? Yes. It doesn't really account for the death by crucifixion part, but at least puts him on the cross. Does it account for the sincere belief that God raised Jesus from the dead on behalf of the group of disciples? Again, in part. And the reason being this is resurrection. This is important. According to the disciples, how they define their theology of resurrection is not a resuscitation. The resurrection theology that we have in in the Apostle Paul's writings, other writings, is that it was a resurrection to immortality and incorruptibility. Um, so, and you'll see this is going to be really weird for them to think about. So let's go through this. Roman executioners could be relied upon to ensure that the victims were dead. And even Pontius Pilate, we've been studying the book of Mark here at Mount Carmel, he was concerned when he heard that Jesus died within the first day of hanging on the cross, which is generally just unheard of. The criminals would hang on the cross several days, and it was a long, drawn-out death. Jesus is put on the cross early in the morning, and by the afternoon he's dead. But what's interesting is because it doesn't hit Pontius' ear right, he actually gets confirmation. He gets the centurion who was responsible, who was part of the execution squad. Come tell me if he's actually dead. And of course, the centurion confirms it. There's the piercing through his side. And again, other historical works attest to that Pontius Pilate carried out completely the execution. And then even modern science massively disconfirms through medical facts that Jesus could not have endured being scourged. We got to remember that. I mean, they pretty much whipped him within an inch of his life, and then it's the long drawn out part on the cross. And Jesus could not have rolled away the stone and walked on pierced feet. This is, so he revives in the coolness of the tomb. So he's whipped and put up on the cross on a Friday. He gets one day off, and then he's got to raise up, roll away the stone, and walk back into Jerusalem. And now think about this. This is the part where I'm getting to the minimal fact too. A half-dead man, desperately in need of medical attention because he still would have been that way, could not incite the disciples to believe that he was the risen Lord, nor inspire their robust theology of resurrection. That's the part. They may have sincerely believed he was like resuscitated. What gives them this? Jesus was raised to immortality and incorruptibility, and we will too. The point is being this: if Jesus's body, if it's apparent death, and Jesus's body is the model for our resurrection, we're all in trouble. Okay, I mean it's just the case. Nobody wants that resurrection body if it's the apparent death theory. And then the last one is, does Paul not just re-crucify Jesus? So let's just say, Jesus endures the cross, somehow convinces this group of followers, this is resurrection. It really is. And years later, he confronts the Apostle Paul. And what makes you think the Apostle Paul, who is then an enemy of the church, doesn't just snatch Jesus up and send him right back to the cross? It would have been completely underwhelming for the Apostle Paul. And again, this is another one. By now, it may be popular on the internet, and even then, this one's really wanting. Most scholars outright dismiss it. It just doesn't hold weight as it used to. There used to be, there may be something to this. It doesn't account for all three facts. And then here's the one. If you want to know what's out there, what's the most popular theory, even among scholars, it would be the hallucination theory. Now, what they're saying is that the disciples, under their distress as a group, hallucinated the appearances of Jesus. So, and so I'm in part sympathetic to this. It's absolutely true that the disciples were overwhelmed, in fear. They had just dedicated, probably 3 years of their life following this guy around. He's taken in Jerusalem on a Sunday on a donkey, right? And the people are praising him. He's the Son of David. Save us. Hosanna, Hosanna. And before the week's out, the government executes him for treason. That's tough. And so they're afraid. They're distancing. If you look at the Gospels, it's one of the most embarrassing admissions. If the Gospels are completely made up, You probably just don't write yourself like Peter, who's the apostle, the leader of the early church, and everybody knows like this man denied Jesus. I mean, could you imagine that? The PR problem it would create if it's not just the truth. Like it's reality. I did. I didn't identify with him. So I'm sympathetic, and I think that's one reason why the theory kind of holds weight, because you have the group of disciples who would have been distressed. That's what I'm trying to get at. And then the Apostle Paul, what they maintain with that is his distress that would have caused him to hallucinate would maybe, and notice this is all in some ways conjecture. We're sympathizing. We're trying to kind of maybe put ourselves in his shoes. We're doing like psychoanalysis of men that lived 2,000 years ago. It's hard to do psychoanalysis with people sitting right in front of you. But nevertheless, we're trying to look at these other theories. Is that the Apostle Paul would have hallucinated Jesus' appearance because of his distress over persecuting people who followed Jesus. That he was essentially having this, time of, conscience, like crisis in his conscience, and just believed that Jesus appeared to him. Now, a couple of things. Let's go back to the minimal facts. Number one, does the hallucination theory account for Jesus' death by crucifixion? Yeah, it's taken for granted. Like, yep, that's assumed. He actually died. Nobody's denying that. The second thing is, does it account for the group of disciples' sincere belief? And then does it account for the Apostle Paul's sincere belief? And it gets the closest. Okay? So, but a couple of things. Number one, it says nothing at all about the empty tomb. And I'll never forget when I first heard the hallucination theory, like I said, like, there's something there. The problem is this. Where is the body of Jesus? You could almost say this. It's a historical fact that Jesus' tomb was empty on resurrection or on Easter Sunday, right? There was nothing there. The point is this: if these men are hallucinating the appearances, that doesn't get rid of the body of Jesus. So if you're claiming that he appeared, all it takes then is for the enemies of Jesus, the Sanhedrin, right? The Roman centurions and Pontius, to go back to the tomb and pull out the body of Jesus. Okay? And to go, look, like, you guys are tripping, but here's this dead man. So all they have to do is produce the body. And the fact, this is what's so amazing. If you go read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, theories come forward about, well, the disciples stole the body. The enemies say that. The disciples stole the body. And you gotta understand what an amazing admission that is that the enemies of Jesus sit there and are saying, we don't have the body, right? They're looking to produce the body, and they cannot find the body. So a hallucination theory, in some ways, like, yes, it can account for their belief that he raised, but how sincere is that belief in the sense of it doesn't get rid of the body of Jesus. Somebody can produce the evidence. And I'll go back to that in a minute. Number two, even if the bereaved can experience tangible hallucinations, because the Gospels describe it as multi-sensory. They saw Jesus, they touched Jesus. Everybody see what I'm saying? More than just one. In general, from psychological studies, hallucinations usually are one sense. Somebody sees something. I mean, so you have sight, hearing, because Jesus spoke to them and they touched him. So there's three senses involved. And generally, if you're hallucinating, I don't know. I mean, but what's described is something was seen, something was heard, something was felt, like a sensation. So it's rare to have hallucinations in which all three are kind of working together. But also, here's another part. is I'll get to, I'll go ahead and get it now. Psychologically, group hallucinations are impossible. And it's much more common to experience hallucination in a single mode, seeing, hearing, or touching, than multi-mode. So add on to the layer. So multi-sensory hallucinations are rare. Okay, I'm not saying it's impossible, but rare. It's one step further, because the Gospels maintained, and 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, which is a very early oral tradition from the early church, is that he appeared to groups of people at one time. The Apostle Paul goes so far to say that he appeared to 500 people at one time. Now, and here's the point. Think of it like this when you talk about hallucination. Me and my wife are laying side by side in bed, and I begin to dream, and my wife is in my dream. That does not mean that she is actually occupying space in my dream. It's a projection. It's my individual projection. So no matter her proximity to me, no matter what she's dreaming, she could be having the same dream as me, but what I'm trying to get at is she's not actually in the dream with me. And it's the same thing. You have to bank on when Jesus had these group experiences that 11 of these guys were tripping out at the same time and all confirmed to one another that they were seeing and hearing and touching Jesus in a way that they're like, this is something we all are experiencing or individually experiencing at the same time. So you're ramping up the rarity. I mean, so is it like, I guess what you're saying, is it possible? Yeah, right. I guess it's possible. But it would be, just absolutely, utterly improbable. And then there is no evidence to suggest that Paul struggled with any guilt complex with persecuting Christians. If you go back and read just the testimony of Paul, he will tell you, if you ask him, Paul, were you laboring under a sincere, guilt for persecuting Christians? And he actually, all throughout his life, maintains his innocence. He goes, look, before Christ came, I consider this a blasphemous cult, essentially, that Judaism needed to get rid of. So he tells, prior to Christ, this was not murder in his mind. It wasn't abuse in his mind. He was weeding out terrible theological error. These people have converted to Christianity. They think this Jesus is the Son of God, and this is ludicrous. So if you go read Galatians 1, Philippians 3, even there's statements of it in his throughout the book of Acts when he gives his own testimony. And then even in the book of 1 Timothy, he makes statements going, I was blameless. He did not consider what he was doing to be wrong. He thought he was doing the right thing in persecuting the church. So again, what you have to take, and I never forget, we always with Dr. William Lane Craig, when in his class, when he was going over his defense of the resurrection, and somebody asked him, said, Dr. Craig, if God did not really raise Jesus from the dead, what is it that you would believe? And he said, you would have to believe in some kind of conspiracy. And here's what he meant by that. You'd have to take one or two or more of the theories that I've just given you, and they have to be happening at the same time. So for instance, he's like, let me give you an example. He says, if you had to cover the facts, you would have to say, so Jesus dies by crucifixion. It's not swoon. He actually died. Then, unbeknownst to anybody, somebody like a necromancer, this is somebody who worships the dead, would have been in Jerusalem at the time. Jesus is a famous, miracle worker and teacher, and they overcome the guards, the stone, whatever it is, and they take the body of Jesus. So it's a third party, not the disciples, not the enemies of Jesus, not the Sanhedrin, not Pontius and the Romans, but someone that nobody, like history doesn't attest to. And then on top of that, you have the hallucination theory that falls. And so at that point, you got to believe, and he was saying not like you got to believe in some type of conspiracy, not that it was intentionally contrived, but unintentionally happened. Some party we don't know about took the body of Jesus, and then these guys actually, in one of the most rare forms in history, actually hallucinated these appearances to such an extent that they sincerely believe God raised Jesus from the dead. And he says, and that's you're left with something like that. There's a few other ones that are interesting. Bart Ehrman still leaves on the table that Jesus had a twin, which is or was subbed out by like Simon of Cyrene when he picked up the cross. So these are and again, what you need to know is this: is there any evidence other than like that allusion to Simon, this third party that's historically non-existent in Jerusalem? You're having to bank on, like, believe something else is happening that is not mentioned anywhere. That there's absolute no evidence for it, but you'll trust it over any evidence that is offered. Now, what we'll talk about tomorrow, I'll be done with this, is we're going to look at the supernatural explanation of the facts. We'll consider the theory that God raised Jesus from the dead. And the best way I can tell you about it is essentially this: does it have the explanatory power to account for all three facts? And then I think you can go one step further. Can it shed light on other issues that a real resurrection, and I was preparing for Sunday. I mean, if you think about it, if God raised Jesus from the dead, that's terrifying. Right? I mean, right now, I mean, sometimes you get so accustomed to hearing it, and you're like, that's really awesome and victorious. It's like, you understand what we're like saying? This is terrifying implications. And it actually, I think, explains some other things than just the three facts. So that's part 2. Again, don't forget. And if you got any questions, comments, rude remarks, drop them in the chat, and I'll do my best to either answer them tomorrow, because tomorrow should be it as far as the part 3. I should be able to finish it. And I'm just doing this on a popular level. If you want, I mentioned this in my last time together, or part 1. If you want to read more about it, I would encourage you to pick up anything that Michael Licona has written. I think it's histographical. I gotta find it so that I can show it to you tomorrow. Approach to the Resurrection. It's a book about this thick, and I don't say that to intimidate you. If you want to see a thorough investigation into all the historical material, read Mike Lacona's book. If you want something just on a popular level, that's kind of reduces that and gives you the scope, kind of doesn't show you the minutia, but at least gives you the theories behind it, is Michael Licona and Gary Habermas wrote a book entitled The Case for the Resurrection. And in fact, I don't even think they used the 3 minimal facts. I think they actually go through 12 in that book. And then, like I mentioned, Dr. William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith book, he has a section devoted to the resurrection of Jesus, and it's really good as well. Those are kind of like my go-to resources, and there's some other popular works, but those are the ones that I've been personally impressed by. So take the time to check those out. But I'm saying, if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them tomorrow. So just leave them in the chat whenever you're watching this. And don't forget about Easter Sunday here at Mount Carmel. We'll be in the field out back. Text RSVP to our text and church number 706-525-5351, and come out and worship with us. And even if you're not a believer, right, and you're just checking out what this Jesus is about, we would be delighted to introduce you to him through the teaching of his word. So come on out and participate with us. Y'all have a great rest of the day. I'm going to finish up my coffee and hopefully finish up my sermon. It's a great thing when you can finish it early in the week and think about it some more. So, anyways, y'all have a great day. Love you guys.